Hello, and hope you're doing wonderful this Tuesday, May 20, 2025. Wow, just like that, we're entering the final lap of May 2025, right? We're entering the third trimester, if you may, of the month of May. How has your day been? How's your week been? Well, first of all, to all of those who have had one form of the week or the other, if it's been a challenging week thus far, we pray strength for you. I know some people have lost someone dear to them recently in the community I belong to. If you happen to be listening to me, may the strength of God be with you. I also know that in some other communities it's joy all the way. In some other places I'm connected to, there have been a lot of graduations for the month of May. Congratulations. And for the rest of us, let's stay strong and let's keep going even as we continue these weekly conversations. So welcome to Amoge Radio Communications. And this week on the program, we continue the theme, our quarterly theme. Remember, our quarterly theme on Art for My program every Tuesday has been on national innovation systems, right? Now we're talking about driving economic growth with innovation. I repeat, driving economic growth with innovation. That's been the title or the theme of the program, right? Last quarter, we talked about developing national innovation systems to absorptive capacity, and we're looking at the national innovation systems as well as the absorptive capacity element. The national innovation systems, there being the systemic framework that nations put in place, not just organizations, but nations put in place in terms of policies, in terms of processes, in terms of the synergy between the town and the gown, in terms of funding, in terms of, all of those things, as well as the absorptive capacity, which had to do largely, or which has to do largely with the ability to translate research into economic and social development. So last quarter we looked at both. However, this quarter we decided to focus on the economic and social development aspect of it, driving economic growth with innovation. So one of the things we've kept emphasizing, especially this quarter, is that it cannot be innovation for the sake of innovation. It has to be innovation for the purpose of economic growth. In other words, this quarter has largely been about the absorptive capacity, right? That's why we decided to title the program this quarter, Driving Economic Growth with Innovation. Now, like we always do, we're going to quickly do a recap. We're going to begin with a recap of the highlights of last week's episode. So last week, episode 5 of Driving Economic Growth with Innovation, we looked at, the factors, the critical factors for research commercialization. I repeat, the critical factors for research commercialization. And the reason we needed to dive into that is because research, like we've been saying, cannot be for the sake of research. It has to be for the purpose of commercialization. We are thinking of economic growth, innovation for the purpose of economic growth. In other words, when you're thinking about driving economic growth with innovation, you're thinking about moving all the way from conceptualization to commercialization, right? And that's one thing we've kept advocating for. When you talk about innovation, it's not just the conceptualization of the creative idea, that's just creativity, right? It's not just novelty for the sake of novelty, but it's conceptualization all the way to commercialization. But certain things enable research commercialization. Certain factors make it easier to, commercialize the research, and certain other factors serve as hindrances or barriers to the research commercialization. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the factors that both enable and frustrate research commercialization, that both accelerate and hinder research commercialization. That was 2 weeks ago. But last week, we decided to zoom in a bit more on the critical factors for research commercialization. In other words, the enablers of research commercialization. So we talked about the fact that studies continue to show that research commercialization is a very collaborative effort. Now, we've been saying this since last quarter. Please subscribe to our Amoge Radio Communications YouTube page. Share it with your loved ones. Share it on your groups. Share it on your platforms. This is not about us. There is so much to gain. There are so many programs. We have over 240 episodes from different themes, from strategy to geopolitical issues to innovation to economic issues to strategic HR. and so on and so forth. It's a rich reservoir of unending knowledge, right? Please subscribe to Amoge Radio Communications, our YouTube page, and encourage your loved ones, friends, and communities to do same too. So on Amoge Radio Communications on our YouTube page, you will find these episodes, these previous episodes. You will see us talking about, the two elements. In other words, the factors that frustrate as well as the factors that accelerate research commercialization 2 weeks ago. Then last week, we zoomed in particularly on the factors that enable research commercialization. And then we said last week that research commercialization is a very collaborative effort. This is a point we've been making since last quarter when we talk about developing national innovation systems. We saw that the synergy, not just between the town and ground, but even between those who are proposing research policies or innovation policies, as well as those who are implementing, who tend to be more in the industry, that synchronization, that collaboration, the effectiveness of the of the sync, right, between all the collaboration agents, so to say, amongst all the people, all the factors, all the sectors, all the agencies that come together to facilitate research, to catalyze commercialization of research, can be very critical to whether or not we move from conceptualization to commercialization. We saw this a lot last quarter, but we are seeing it again this quarter. The studies continue to show that research commercialization is a highly collaborative effort. This was one of our starting thoughts last week, right? There are certain factors, like we said, that are enablers, that are stimulants, that are catalysts, that are likely to help, these factors which are likely to help ensure that there is a successful commercialization of research. I repeat, one of the things we said last week is that there are certain factors, enablers, stimulants, catalysts, which are likely to help ensure that there is a successful commercialization of research. Now, it is important for nations to identify the factors which are, enabling the effectiveness of their research commercialization. Now, I need to say something here. This can be highly contextual. I repeat, this can be highly contextual. For some of us, we may have seen something that's gone a bit viral in the last 2 days, at least in the last 24 hours. For those who are in Africa or those who connect with Africa a lot, something has been going around and people have been commenting on it, right? So there's a picture of a group of investors who came together, and they came together and they are trying to invest in Africa, right? They are, I want to be careful with my use of adverbs. I do not want to say supposedly trying to invest in Africa, or let me at the minimum say that they are attempting, they appear to be, or they are endeavoring, let me use that expression, they are endeavoring to invest in Africa. And according to these investors, they are trying to, sort of stimulate the tech industry, particularly in Africa. Now, the challenge is, this is a table, I think, somewhere in East Africa. And on this table, the picture shows about 10 people, 10 supposed investors in a nation in Africa, and not a single one of them is African. And this picture went viral, and different investors have been commenting, beg your pardon. And part of the challenges has been, the challenge of investors is exactly why would you be investing, or would you be supposedly attempting to invest in research commercialization, because they are specifically targeting the tech industry in Africa. So the question is, exactly why do you claim to be attempting to, support tech startups in Africa, and there is not a single African in the group? Now, I'm not going to comment especially on the specifics of, the quote and unquote, the or the degree. Let me not just say the specifics. I'm not going to comment on the degree to which this is about Africa or this is about the investors. The reason I'm saying that is this, and this is one of the comments I like the best. The reason I'm saying that is that as a nation and as a continent, if you do not have your own research commercialization strategy, others will create one that will work in their favor. And those are some of the comments I've enjoyed specifically. I read a particular gentleman, his name is Willie Insabiyumva. I hope I'm pronouncing his name well. And in commenting on this, he said he was quoting the president of President Kagame of Rwanda, and he said, look, as somebody who helps African startups and SMEs reach their goal, that is Willie Insabiyumva. His LinkedIn profile reads, helping African startups and SMEs reach their goal. He said, as someone who does this, President Kagame has always inspired his work and influenced his philosophy. Is apparently Rwandan. He then said, there's a saying we have in Rwanda called Agaciro. I hope I'm pronouncing that well. Agaciro. It means dignity. And like Kagame always says, Agaciro ni wowe ukia, which means dignity is not given, it is taken. Agaciro ni wowe ukia. He then went further to say that if Africans, right, he said, if Africans do not have a strategy, a viable solution to fund their own businesses, then they are going to find out that other investors will come and create models that best suits them. And I liked it when he said, look, Africa doesn't have a resource problem, right? We have a management problem. Africa doesn't lack an entrepreneurial mindset, right? We lack frameworks to do business professionally. I mean, I was excited when I read other comments on this picture that has gone viral, like I said, but I liked him because he was more or less saying, let's take responsibility. You know, he said, look, the number of SMEs in Africa that could become billion-dollar corporations if they were properly managed is countless. He said, but what did we do? He said, what we do in Africa is that we run to the startup model of doing business, a model that is fundamentally foreign, imported, and often lacks content. A mindset that has now been disseminated to young founders where they start thinking like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, but they are in Africa. He said that truth explains why local capital doesn't fund these startups, because they don't make sense in local context and markets. Now, like I said, I'm not going to comment on the level of quote and unquote commitment that these 10 men in Africa have to a continent they want to invest in, and there is not a single African on the table. I'm not going to comment on how much they are committed, the level of genuineness of their commitment, because look, they are first and foremost investors. They are first and foremost invested in making money. They first and foremost have the commercialization mindset, which we have been advocating on this program. If you remember last week, one of the highlights from last week's program, we said, look, there is not and this is not just us, even the research, of the 5 factors that we went on to identify as being the enablers of research commercialization. The number one we spoke about last week, before this picture went viral, by the way, is an entrepreneurship mindset. We said that the research indicated that an entrepreneurship mindset, as well as the resources and support, plays a critical role in helping nations gain, the competitive advantage through innovation. A 1999 study, based on what we shared last week, based on the research, and we shared this last week, a 1999 study found that the entrepreneurial mindset plays a critical role in helping nations gain competitive advantage through innovation. Why is this now relevant to this picture that has gone viral? These people who came are not primarily whites or Europeans or Americans or Western or of Western origin. They are primarily investors. They are primarily entrepreneurs. And like we said last week, this has been the missing factor. I mean, this for me is just like a confirmation of what we've been saying. the fact that we do not have a sufficient entrepreneurial orientation has not really helped us. So I'm not gonna play the blame game like this man I just quoted, this Rwandan. Rather, every nation, every region, every continent accepts more responsibility for commercializing their research. You cannot fail to create your research commercialization frameworks and then begin to blame those who come in and cash in on the gap. So this is what this particular program, this particular quarters program has been about, and what we began to discuss, even last week. So the entrepreneurship mindset was identified as the number one factor to research commercialization. Remember, research commercialization or innovation commercialization, and like I keep saying, innovation is not innovation without commercialization. So I'd rather even say the commercialization of the invention of the research, right, does not happen without that entrepreneurial mindset. And that is why, like we've been saying since 3 weeks ago, the goal of innovation must be economic growth. I repeat, the goal of innovation must be economic growth. Ab initio, from the beginning, there must now be a strategic synchronization between those who are developing economic policies and those who are in charge of national innovation frameworks. So this is the gap I believe these investors are cashing in on in a continent like Africa. So wherever you find yourself, in Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, wherever you may be, what you need to ask yourself as a nation is, do we have research commercialization policies? I've been saying for the last 3 weeks, we now need institutes of innovation commercialization. Another factor we identified last week is that the research is saying there is insufficient creation of commercialization processes and strategy. That yes, there is innovation, let me call it creativity. There's creativity going on, there is invention going on, but there doesn't seem to be a sufficient creation of commercialization processes and strategies. That the reality, in fact, one of the studies said it plainly, that the reality is that review of the commercialization aspect is lacking. It says national strategic technology is being promoted in various fields, but I'm quoting verbatim, national strategic technology is being promoted in various fields, but the reality is that review of the commercialization aspect is lacking. In other words, some nations keep investing funds in and resources, right? Financial resources, human resources, and other kinds of resources. They keep investing resources in the process of the inventions, but they are not simultaneously thinking all the way through to the commercialization of those inventions. Do you understand? This is the part that the nations that have learned. I remember last week that Apple is currently worth about $3 trillion. The nations, and that's just an example, nations like the United States that have learned to cash in on their inventions, that have learned to commercialize their research, that have learned to commercialize their inventions, such nations do not just think about funding inventions or creativity, they also think all the way through the process of turning the research into economic progress, creating jobs, creating industries, expanding markets, gaining global competitive advantage, growing GDP per capita. Do you understand? These things are not going to happen by themselves. That's what the research is showing. And so, again, please do not cry too much if you think other nations are coming in to cash in on the gaps from a national point of view, like we have been advocating from last quarter and even more strongly in this quarter. The job of national policymakers is to begin to strategically, and entrepreneurially develop research commercialization policies and strategies. I totally agree with the gentleman from Uganda. Nobody's going to do it for you if you do not create those frameworks to take full advantage of your own inventions. Others are going to come in and commercialize what you are failing to commercialize, as has been the case for a very, very long time. So once again, I am going to appeal with everything in me. The goal of this particular quarters program is to passionately advocate for national innovation policies, processes, strategies that will stimulate economic growth. It has to be intentional. It has to be synergistic. You have to synergize innovation with economic goals. And innovation cannot be for the purpose of innovation. It has to be for the purpose of economic growth. Once the gap is there and you are not capitalizing sufficiently on your own inventions as a nation, other nations or nationals who have the entrepreneurial mindset are going to recognize the gap and cash in on it, and that's because they are drinking entrepreneurial. End of story. This is still Tola Mother on Amoge Radio Communications. Remember, the program is driving economic growth with innovation, and we are talking very passionately, very deliberately, very assiduously about the need to create those research commercialization strategies, research commercialization policies that ensure that nations can take optimal advantage of the inventions by their nations, citizens happening around them that they are supporting. Otherwise, other investors will come in and take full advantage of it. Well, there's one more thing I still want us to look at, looking at the practicalities of these issues, because these things are not, we're not just talking in the air. They're not just theoretical. They are real issues. They are things that are happening. They are things that people are bothered about. They are things that people are reacting to, quote and unquote. And we are saying that instead of reacting to them, we should be responding to them. What is the difference? When we are reacting, it has happened and we are crying foul. When we are responding, we are anticipating those gaps. We are looking at the challenges and we are saying, we need to do something about this. Now, there was something I read that was also interesting. They said African countries don't appear in the top 30 world's biggest exporters list. Not even close. Can you imagine? The combined total export value of the 54 African countries is around $640 billion. That's almost equivalent to the value of South Korea's annual export. Let me break that down. So, South Korea as a nation, just one nation, but remember, this is the nation where your Samsung phone, if you are using one, is probably produced, right? South Korea as one nation has a combined export value that is about that of the whole of the 54 countries in Africa. Is that not problematic? And this person went on to say, this, by the way, is Netsalim Bahiru Gebri. Again, this person is a program director at Goal Global, right? And this person is interested in market systems development. This person said, Africa's export profile remains commodity heavy, lacking the manufacturing and value-added inclusion. Remember, we were talking about this very passionately about 2 weeks ago or so, that without research commercialization, you cannot operate at the competitive end of the global value chain. You cannot be adding value. You will keep exporting raw materials and re-importing the finished product. And once there's no value addition, we are not expanding manufacturing. You are not creating jobs. You will be spending your own currency chasing after other international currencies. You will draw down the value of your currency, and I can go on and on with the impact of all of that. So we need to think research commercialization. We need to think commercialization and scaling, because commercialization includes scaling them meaning selling at a high volume. And that is when, as nations, you begin to export the kind of high value, quantity, and quality of products that will drive economic growth. These things have to be intentionally planned, strategically driven, and resolutely pursued. You cannot leave it to chance. If you leave it to chance, other people are going to cash in on the gap in your economy, and they are going to take full advantage of it, and you will simply be reacting. So, like I said, I refuse to comment on the picture from a reactive point of view. I'm going to stick to this responsive and proactive strategy of saying we must develop research commercialization strategies, national innovation policies that ensure we are intentional about driving economic growth and innovation. We are not reactive. We are intentionally clear about the economic goals we want to use innovation to pursue. We are setting those goals in terms of GDP growth. We are setting those goals in terms of GDP per capita increase. We are setting those goals in terms of employment. We are setting those goals in terms of increase in the value of our local currencies. These goals must be clearly predetermined, and then we now say, how do we use innovation to track these goals? So the entrepreneurial mindset was one of the factors we identified last week as critical for research commercialization. And this is just the first of the five. Oh my God. I'm not sure that we can go further than this week. But let me tell you something. We are going to come back. We are going to come back, and let me tell you what we are looking at. Let me just kind of lay the foundation for subsequent week. I doubt if we can go deep into it, but I promise you we still have a couple of weeks to go in this quarter, and we are not in a hurry. If need be, we will continue the next quarter, because we must make the change that is important. We must make the change that will impact our economies. We must make the change that will impact our people. We must make the change that will impact our local currencies, employment, reverse the negative trend of brain drain. And I'm speaking to different economies. You know where you are as an economy. If you are strong, because even South Korea, that has a combined export value that is more than 54 African countries, or equivalent to 54 African countries, is still saying, how do we improve in research commercialization? 2 weeks ago, I spoke about a 2024 study in South Korea that is still looking at research commercialization. So there is no room for complacence. They are still saying, what can we do better? As of today, China is said to be the nation that is the largest exporter of value-added goods, and I think it's about, if I remember well, about $33 trillion. I can't remember the exact figure, but the point is, even China is saying, how can we improve? Even China recognizes that geopolitical issues can significantly thwart their dominance, and so the question is, how do we ensure that we continue to export? How do we ensure that we continue to compete? How do we ensure that our research commercialization strategies keeps us in a strong position? I'll give you a simple example. I was listening to Satya Nadella yesterday, and they were introducing a new product. Satya Nadella, for those who don't know, is the CEO of Microsoft, and they were introducing a new product, and guess what? They decided to make it open source, and I smiled. What are they doing? Before the subscription fees of artificial intelligence products, that's AI products, used to be high, used to be pretty expensive, and DeepSeek, which is a Chinese company, came and flooded that model early this year. The shares, the value of many artificial intelligence and tech companies in the United States went down because they suddenly crashed the model. And I wasn't surprised when Microsoft came back and more or less had to adapt to that, because if they don't respond appropriately, the market may reject their innovation. And that brings me to the foundation I want to lay for what we are going to be talking about. Now, last week, I don't have enough time to go over the key highlights of every single thing last week. Like I said, please go back and listen to those programs. It's a rich reservoir, especially for those who are policymakers, policy influencers, and even the policy demanders that want to bring change like we want to, right? One of the things we said in closing last week, there were 5 major points that we made that are critical enablers. We've only been able to touch the first one. That's the entrepreneurial mindset, right? But in closing, we said something that is very critical last week. We said that ultimately, in closing, we asked the question, where is the adaptation? How do we respond? Right? We said that if research is not for the sake of research, but for the sake of commercialization, if innovation is not for the sake of innovation, but for the sake of economic growth, then there must be a connection with the buyers, with the market, right? They must be sensitive to consumer behavior, supplier participation. We spoke about different studies. There were specific studies trying to understand the research commercialization process. Those studies looked at consumer behavior, they looked at supplier participation, they looked at buyer strategic decision, and we said there should be more of such studies understanding buyer response to new products. There was a particular study we looked at last week that was just looking at the buyer response to specifically new products and innovation, not just general products, but the new products. In other words, how is the market responding to your innovation, right? What exactly is the market saying in terms of your attempts to introduce the invention? So that helps you understand how to better stimulate and maintain demand, right? And adapt innovation for commercialization. Take note of that. When you study the buyer response, when you study the supplier participation, when you look at how the market is responding to the invention, so that your path to commercialization is as effective as possible, what you are doing is you are getting ready to make the necessary adaptations so that there will be the innovation adaptation for commercialization. Take note of that. We asked the question in closing. Yes, we said, where one of the questions you should be saying, when I say you, as the policy makers for research commercialization, as those responsible for driving economic growth and innovation at the national level, at the regional level, you should be saying, why is there such a high demand for a particular new product? Remember, when you look at buyer response to new products and innovation and inventions, where you're trying to stimulate and maintain demand, the reason you are doing all this, remember, is to ensure innovation adaptation for commercialization. Take note of that. Innovation adaptation. I said it earlier, I'm repeating it. Innovation adaptation for commercialization, because that's where we are going next week. But to make that effective, to ensure an effective innovation adaptation for commercialization, one of the questions you should be asking is, why is there such a high demand for a particular new product and a low demand for another one? Why is there a seasonal demand? Right? Because to fully commercialize your research, your inventions, right, it's important for you to have full-scale returns. And for you to have full-scale returns, the market must be ready for what you're introducing. The market must be receiving it. And if the market is not receiving it appropriately, you must get the necessary feedback so you can make the required adaptations. Please take note of that. When you see your Apple products, either your iPhone, come out with a new one, when you see introductions of things like touchscreen, I remember 15-20 years ago, there was no touchscreen. It's because those inventions are anticipating and responding to the market demands. Extremely important. When you see your tab, initially they were in tabs, what we had were laptops or small laptops, but we now have your tablet. Again, it's about anticipating and responding to the market demands. Well, I can go on and on and on. You have to understand that the reason for all those things, gathering all those things, especially the last point, the last 2 points, we gave 5 points last week on the factors that enable research commercialization. The first one, like I said, is an entrepreneurial mindset. We shared another 2, but the last 2 we said were about understanding the market. There must be more studies of consumer behavior and supplier participation, buyer strategic decision, what makes the buyers buy in scale, and there should be more studies of buyer response to new products and inventions, so that this helps understand how to better, helps markets, nations, policymakers, policy designers, policy implementers, helps them to better understand how to stimulate and maintain demand, also that they can better adapt innovation for commercialization. And like I said, the closing question was and still is, we should be asking ourselves, why is there such a high demand for a particular new product and a low demand for another? Why is there seasonal demand? Because to fully commercialize your research, in order to have full-scale returns, you must make sure that the market is ready for those inventions and the market is responding appropriately. And if the market is not ready for it, then you must be adapting as a nation, as a big player. You must be adapting, just like we saw Microsoft more or less doing. It'll be interesting to see what happens. But right now, they looked at DeepSeek crash, more or less disrupt. I think that's the word. DeepSeek's move was highly disruptive to the artificial intelligence market, as it previously was, where there were very high subscription fees. But the moment DeepSeek came in and crashed the prices and made it open source and found a way around the high energy costs, they had to come out and respond to that significant change in the market. Otherwise, it is highly predictable that there will be a significant decline in the demand for American-made artificial intelligence products. So whoever is responsible for research commercialization, innovation, full-scale optimization in the United States from the economic growth point of view is definitely supportive of that process that will help the artificial intelligence and the tech companies in the United States to respond And that is why you can see them more or less matching China and responding to what DeepSeek did by also creating an open source product. That's Microsoft. That's just one example. So I just want to really appeal to us. These things are very real. These things are very these things are very critical. These things are crucial determinants of what happens in the economy. At a point some weeks ago, I remember the companies called the Magnificent Seven in the United States. They suddenly had, those are top tech companies. They had a nosedive in their stock prices, in their capital, in their share value. But thankfully, it's picked up. Thankfully for them, it's picked up. But it's not picking up off and by itself. It's picking up because the national policies are also responsive to the market. And that is the whole point of this program. The whole point of research commercialization is market responsiveness. I repeat, the whole point of research commercialization, one of the key drivers of this particular program this quarter, the last couple of weeks, has been about market responsiveness. The reason you are studying how the market is responding to your new products, to your inventions, is so you can adapt appropriately. And that's why, like I said, we are laying the foundation, and next week our focus is going to be on innovation adaptation for commercialization. Well, I think this is where we're going to draw a curtain on this edition of the program. I hope it made some sense to you. Remember, innovation adaptation for commercialization is critical. The reason you are studying the market is to respond to the market. The reason you are studying the response of the buyers to your new inventions is to respond appropriately and to adapt as necessary. That is when research is no longer for the sake of research, but it is for the sake of commercialization. That's when it is now innovation for the sake of economic growth, and economic growth happens when the market is accepting of what you are pushing, right? Your new inventions. That's when you can cash in fully on the innovation investments that you have made as a nation. Please, please, and please, for the sake of your nations, for the sake of your citizens, for the sake of your economies, for the sake of your dependents, those who are patriotic about your nations, who believe in your nations. This is not something to take lightly at all. It's something to focus on. You must work with economists. You must work with those who understand market drivers. You must work as innovation policymakers with those who can read the market, who understand the market, who can study the response to the market, and ensure that all innovative activities are in sync with economic possibilities. This is what we're going to enjoy the curtain on this edition of the program. Hope we've made some sense to you. We will continue to advocate passionately for this. We would like to work with you as a nation. Remember, we're here, we've done this, we'll keep doing this. We are passionate about this. We've worked with nations, we've worked with regional organizations, regional bodies like the Economic Community of West African States. We've worked with supranationals like the German Development Agency. We've worked on several projects at national levels, at regional levels. This is what we are passionate about in Amalgate. We know what we do, and we are very good at what we do. We are passionate about it. We can create frameworks. We can support you. We can also work with you and not just work for you. We can transfer competencies to your people in the process. And by the time we are done, you will see that it is possible to translate all of these things we are saying into measurable economic growth for your people and for your nation. While we are waiting for you to call on us, remember my other colleagues will be here for tomorrow. They'll be talking about these issues, and all through the week, they will talk about economic issues. They will talk about optimizing opportunities, for instance, in the Ethiopian banking sector. My colleague Abiodun Abari will be talking about that. We'll be talking about aligning educational reforms with national development. Daniel Adebi will be talking about that, and so on and so forth. Dr. Titola Ogunshola will be talking about the economy, and Adiola Gbadebo would also be talking about accelerating your career opportunities, working in sync with innovation and technological possibilities. Well, we'll be back same time, same station with this program, Driving Economic Growth, and we'll continue this conversation on innovation adaptation for commercialization. Thank you so much, and we look forward to hearing back from you, getting your feedback. Remember, subscribe to Amalgate Radio Communications, subscribe to our YouTube page, invite others to There's so much this time to learn and grow. I'll be back same time, same station next week. Until then, don't just think research, don't just think innovation, but also think innovation adaptation for the sake of full scale commercialization. Thank you and see you next week. Have a good one.